Welcome to Life Stories, where we share powerful and emotional journeys of love, loss, and self-discovery. Today's story follows Olivia, a woman who faced the painful truth that the man she once loved no longer saw her the way he used to. As she navigates heartbreak and betrayal, Olivia learns the profound lesson of letting go and reclaiming her own happiness. It's a story of finding strength when everything seems lost. Stay tuned as we dive into this powerful journey of resilience. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to begin today's story. The mornings in our home always felt the same. The soft hum of the coffee machine, the smell of freshly brewed coffee filling the air, and the gentle rays of the morning sun peeking through the curtains. It was a peaceful start to the day, a calm before the inevitable chaos. But today, something was different. I stood by the kitchen window, watching the sunrise over the quiet street outside. The neighborhood was still, as it always was at this time. Nothing seemed out of place. Yet, I felt a heaviness in my chest, a tightness that hadn't been there before. I couldn't quite explain it, but I knew deep down that something was shifting in my life. I poured myself a cup of coffee and glanced over at the dining table, where I had already set a candle, vanilla-scented. My favorite. It always gave the room a comforting warmth. It was my way of making the mornings feel special, of holding onto the love that once radiated from every corner of our home. The days when Benjamin would leave little notes on my pillow, when he'd call me during his lunch breaks just to hear my voice, and when spontaneous weekend getaways felt like a normal part of life. I could still feel the echoes of those moments. But they were fading. I tried to convince myself that all marriages go through phases, that things would return to normal once Benjamin's work settled down. He was just busy, that's all. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping away from me. Benjamin had become distant, almost cold. His eyes, once filled with warmth, now seemed to look right through me. He would barely glance at me in the morning, only muttering a quick, distracted, "Good morning," before burying his face in his phone. I had prepared his favorite omelette with toast, hoping to share a moment together. But he barely looked up from his phone as he sipped his coffee. He didn't even acknowledge the plate I set in front of him. "I don't have time. I'm running late," he said, barely giving me a second of attention. His words hit me like a blow. The man I had once known, the man who used to prioritize our time together, was now slipping further and further away. I stood there, a smile frozen on my face, pretending that everything was fine. Even as my heart began to sink, I tried to make conversation, suggesting we have dinner together that evening. But Benjamin was already on his way out the door, his mind occupied with meetings and work. I watched him leave, the door shutting softly behind him, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of emptiness. It wasn't just his physical absence, it was the emotional distance that had grown between us. He was no longer the man who would surprise me with little gestures of affection, or the man who would look at me as if I was the most important person in the world. He was gone, and in his place was someone I no longer recognized. That afternoon, as the hours passed in a blur of household chores and unanswered thoughts, I found myself sitting in the dimly lit living room. The flickering glow of the television illuminated my face, but it couldn't distract me from the gnawing ache in my chest. Benjamin wasn't home yet, and I knew he wouldn't be. His late nights had become a pattern, him leaving early in the morning and returning well past midnight. The smell of a cologne I didn't recognize clung to his clothes when he did come home. But I told myself it was just his work, just his growing responsibilities. But as the days went on, the signs became harder to ignore. The affectionate texts that used to brighten my day had stopped completely. The long, deep conversations we used to share over dinner had turned into short, disconnected exchanges. He no longer noticed when I dressed up or styled my hair differently. And when I reached for his hand at night, he would pull away, pretending to be asleep. It hurt more than I could ever put into words. How had we gotten here? One evening, as I prepared a late dinner, I heard the sound of the front door creaking open. My heart leapt with anticipation, hoping that this time, things might be different. But as soon as Benjamin stepped inside, I knew that nothing had changed. His tie was loosened, his shirt slightly unbuttoned, and his eyes were distant, distracted. as though he was somewhere else entirely. He didn't even notice me as I stood there, trying to hide the disappointment in my voice. "You're home late again," I said softly, trying to sound casual. Benjamin barely acknowledged my words. "Work was crazy," he muttered, rubbing his temples as though I were an inconvenience to his stress. He set his briefcase down and barely looked at me. I didn't press him further. I couldn't. Instead, I bit my lip, holding back the tears that threatened to fall. My heart ached, not just because of his neglect, but because of the overwhelming realization that we were no longer the couple we once were. We were just two people passing through life together, living in the same house, but separated by an invisible wall. "Maybe we could take a weekend off," I suggested, trying to salvage whatever was left of us. Just the two of us. We could go to that cabin we used to love. But Benjamin wasn't interested. "I don't have time for that," he said, dismissively. "Things are changing at the office. I need to focus." The way he said it, "things are changing," sent a cold shiver down my spine. Was it just his job that was changing? Or was it our marriage too? I wanted to ask him. Wanted to demand answers. But I held back. I didn't want to hear the truth. Instead, I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat, watching helplessly as Benjamin slipped further away. As I sat there, watching the man I loved retreat into a shell of himself, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit. Our marriage, the love we had once shared, was slipping through my fingers. And I didn't know how to stop it. Days passed, each one blending into the next. Yet nothing seemed to change. Benjamin continued his routine. The same distant behavior each morning. The same late nights when he returned home only to collapse into bed. His mind elsewhere. I began to wonder, was it his job? Or had I become invisible to him? The man who once adored me, who cherished every moment we spent together, was now a stranger. The weight of this realization pressed down on me. But I couldn't bring myself to confront him. What if it wasn't just work? What if there was something else? The fear that I was losing him to another woman slowly started to take root in my heart. The signs were subtle at first. Small details that didn't make sense. Benjamin's sudden obsession with his appearance. The way he started dressing in more expensive clothes. The frequent visits to the gym. And the way he guarded his phone as if it held a secret. I watched him change before my eyes. And I could no longer deny it. He wasn't the same man who had once whispered sweet nothings to me in the quiet of the night. His eyes, once full of love, now seemed cold and distant. There was no warmth in his touch. No affection in his words. I tried to convince myself that it was all just stress from work. That he was simply going through a phase. But then came the moment that shattered my fragile illusions. One afternoon, as I was tidying up the house, I found something that made my stomach churn. It was a receipt for a high-end jewelry store, tucked away in the glove compartment of his car. My hands trembled as I read it. A delicate diamond bracelet, too small and dainty for my taste. Something I knew Benjamin would never buy for me. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. He had been buying gifts for someone else. Someone who wasn't me. The knot in my stomach tightened. And I knew then that I couldn't ignore the truth any longer. That evening, when Benjamin came home, I tried to act normal. But my mind was racing. My heart pounding in my chest as I watched him walk through the door. His tie loosened and his shirt slightly unbuttoned. He seemed more distracted than usual. His eyes glazed over as he set his briefcase down. I had to ask him. I had to know the truth. I waited until he had poured himself a drink. Then casually, almost nonchalantly, asked, "Where were you today?" My voice trembled, but I kept my face calm, pretending to fold laundry as I watched him closely. "Meetings as usual," he replied, barely looking up. I didn't press him further. But I knew. Deep down, I knew that whatever was happening, it wasn't just about work anymore. He was keeping secrets, and those secrets were eating away at the foundation of our marriage. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the empty space beside me, I realized how much had changed. The man I had once trusted completely was no longer the same. He had drifted away, and I couldn't figure out how to bring him back. It wasn't just the affair. It was the way he made me feel. As if I didn't matter. As if I were a burden he had to endure. The love we once shared was slipping through my fingers. And I was powerless to stop it. I wanted to confront him. To demand the truth. But I was afraid. What if he confirmed my worst fears? What if I was no longer the woman he loved? It was easier to stay in this fog of uncertainty than to face the painful reality that our marriage was crumbling before my eyes. But deep down, I knew I had to face it sooner or later. The silence between us was becoming unbearable. And I could no longer ignore the growing distance between us. The days blurred together as Benjamin continued his absence. Both physically and emotionally, I had almost resigned myself to the idea that I was alone in this marriage. Even though he was still under the same roof. His late nights, his cold indifference, and the way he seemed to slip further away with each passing day were unbearable. I tried to hold on to the memories of our earlier years together, the spontaneous weekends, the late night talks, and the quiet moments we shared, but they felt like distant echoes of a life I no longer recognized. I couldn't deny it any longer. Benjamin was hiding something from me. There was no other explanation. His sudden obsession with his appearance. His long business trips that he never used to take. And the hushed phone calls he'd make in the other room all pointed to one undeniable truth. He was seeing someone else. I hated myself for even considering it. But I couldn't ignore the growing suspicion gnawing at me. One evening, when Benjamin was out again, I gathered the strength to do something I'd been avoiding for weeks. I went to his car, searching for answers. My hands shook as I rifled through the glove compartment, my heart pounding with each passing second. And there it was, a receipt from a high-end jewelry store. One I knew he would never shop at for me. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the delicate diamond bracelet listed on the receipt. It was the final confirmation I needed. My worst fears were true. Benjamin was having an affair. I stood there in the garage, clutching the receipt, feeling the weight of it all pressed down on me. The love of my life, the man I had built a life with, had betrayed me in the most painful way possible. The bracelet was a symbol of everything I had lost, the trust, the affection, and the man who had once promised me forever. When Benjamin came home that night, I knew I had to confront him. I couldn't pretend anymore. I had to know the truth. No matter how much it hurt. I tried to remain calm, to hide the turmoil brewing inside me. But as soon as he walked through the door, I saw it, his eyes. The way he avoided my gaze. It was as if he knew that I knew. And that made it even worse. I waited until we were sitting at the dinner table. The silence between us thick and suffocating. My heart raced as I looked at him, trying to steady my breath. I found something today, I said, my voice steady but trembling beneath the surface. I held up the receipt, my hands shaking. Benjamin froze, his eyes flickering to the paper before he quickly looked away. It's a gift for a colleague, he said, his voice too smooth, too rehearsed. The lie slipped from his lips effortlessly. But I knew it for what it was. I knew better than to believe him. A colleague? I repeated, the bitterness rising in my throat. A gift for a colleague? I had to stop myself from yelling. I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break down. But deep down, I was already breaking. You've been seeing someone else, haven't you, Benjamin? He didn't answer at first. Instead, he reached for his phone, distracted as he scrolled through it. The cold indifference in his actions was like a slap to the face. Finally, he looked up, his eyes filled with irritation. Can we not do this right now? My chest tightened. You've been slipping away for weeks. Benjamin, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I've watched you change. I've seen the way you look at me. Or don't look at me anymore. And now, I know the truth. You're not the man I married. You're not even the man I thought you were. His gaze hardened, and he pushed his chair back, standing up abruptly. This is ridiculous, he muttered, heading for the door. But I couldn't let him leave. I couldn't let him walk away from the mess he had made without facing the consequences. I stood up, my voice shaking with emotion. Where are you going, Benjamin? You've already checked out of this marriage. I can't keep pretending that everything is fine when it's clearly not. I deserve the truth. For a moment, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, guilt, maybe, or regret, but it was gone as quickly as it came. With one final glance, he walked out of the room, leaving me standing there, feeling like I had lost everything. I sank into the chair, the weight of his absence settling in my chest. I had known, deep down, that this day would come. But now that it was here, it was harder to accept than I could have ever imagined. The man I loved, the man I had trusted with everything, had betrayed me, and there was nothing I could do to fix it. The days that followed felt like a slow unraveling. Benjamin came home late each night, his presence in the house nothing more than a shadow of the man I once knew. He barely acknowledged me anymore. And when he did, his words were curt, empty. He was still physically there, but emotionally, he had checked out long ago. It wasn't just the affair I was facing, it was the realization that he no longer cared. Not in the way he once did. And for the first time, I understood that sometimes love isn't enough to hold two people together. I sat in the living room, my gaze unfocused as I stared out the window. I had tried everything to hold onto him, to remind him of the love we once shared. I had planned dinners, tried to bring back those little sparks of affection that once made our relationship so special. But each effort felt futile. Benjamin was slipping further away with every passing day, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I had never felt more powerless. It wasn't just his emotional neglect that hurt. It was the way he treated me, like I was invisible. Like I no longer mattered. His indifference cut deeper than any betrayal. He no longer looked at me the way he once did. And the way he avoided my touch made me feel like a stranger in my own home. There was no longer any warmth in his eyes. No hint of the passion we once shared. He was shutting me out. And I couldn't find a way in. One evening, as I prepared a late dinner, I heard the familiar sound of the front door creaking open. My heart leapt, hoping, perhaps foolishly, that this time might be different. But as soon as Benjamin stepped inside, I knew nothing had changed. His eyes were distant, unfocused, as if he were lost in his own world, far removed from the life we had once built together. He dropped his briefcase on the floor without a word and proceeded to the kitchen, muttering something about a long day at work. But I could see it in his face. He was somewhere else. His mind wasn't here. "Are you okay?" I asked softly, my voice barely above a whisper. He barely glanced up, offering me a distracted smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just tired," he replied, his voice distant. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but instead, I forced myself to remain calm. "Maybe we could talk later," I suggested, desperate for some connection, some semblance of the man I once loved. But Benjamin's response was quick and dismissive. "I don't have time for that right now." His words hit me like a slap. The final confirmation of everything I had feared. Benjamin was no longer the man I had married. He had become someone I didn't recognize. That night, as I lay in bed, my mind racing, I couldn't help but feel the weight of everything that had changed. The love I had once held for him was slipping through my fingers, fading like smoke in the wind. I had given everything to this marriage, and in return, I was left with a hollow version of the man I had once called my partner. The silence between us was deafening, and I couldn't ignore the truth any longer. Benjamin had moved on, emotionally, if not physically. He was no longer the person I had once known. And for the first time in my life, I realized that I couldn't make him love me again. The thought of losing him completely was terrifying. But it was also liberating. It was clear that I couldn't keep holding on to someone who no longer wanted to be with me. I had spent so much time trying to save our marriage. But I was the only one fighting. Benjamin had already given up. And I was left to pick up the pieces of my broken heart. I realized then that I had to let go. I couldn't keep chasing after someone who had already walked away. It was time to face the painful truth, that our love had faded. And no amount of hope could bring it back. As difficult as it was to accept, I knew I had to move on. It was the only way I could begin to heal. As the days went by, Olivia embraced the painful truth that her marriage to Benjamin was over. She no longer cried over the man who had once been her everything. Instead, she focused on herself, on rediscovering her strength, rebuilding her life, and learning to be happy again without relying on someone else's love to define her worth. It wasn't easy, but with time, she found peace in her own heart. Benjamin, on the other hand, was left to wallow in regret. His life had crumbled beneath him. The woman he had traded for someone better was gone. And now he was alone, surrounded by the emptiness of the life he had built on illusions. He realized too late that Olivia had been the one thing worth fighting for. But now she had moved on, stronger and happier without him. Olivia's journey was far from over. But she was no longer the broken woman she once was. She had learned the hardest lesson of all, that sometimes letting go is the only way to move forward. And as she walked confidently into her future, she knew that she would never again settle for less than she deserved. If you found Olivia's story inspiring, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on post notifications so you never miss a new life story. Thank you for watching, and we hope these stories continue to resonate with you, offering strength, healing, and the reminder that we are all capable of moving forward, no matter what life throws our way.